I'm reading all from the book, All the Women of the Bible, and today's story is about Esther and the balance of power. And we are at part 2, where they've just learned of the edict to kill all of the Jews on December the 14th. Well, I sent a message back explaining that I couldn't just barge into the king's inner court anytime I wanted. That I had to wait to be summoned, and anyone who did go in without a summons would be killed instantly, unless the king extended his scepter to him. That was the law. Still is, for that matter. Uncle's answer was classic. The balance of power again. Only this time the Lord God was at the heart of the equation. Don't think for a minute, he said, that you're going to be the one Jew to escape just because you live in the harem of the royal palace. I promise you, you're not. If you keep your mouth shut and think you can hide your race behind a Greek name, you'll perish. And your father's house will vanish with you. And the Lord God will deliver us through someone else's help. Then, for good measure, he added, who can tell? Maybe this was the Lord God's reason for having you come so close to the throne in the first place. What could I do? There I was, caught at the balance point of the powers of earth and heaven, standing between the king and my people, the Lord God's people, to speak his word and maybe save us all, or to be silent and certainly die. No contest, but I was terrified, I tell you. I sent word to Mordecai to start a strict fast with all the Jews in Susa, nothing to eat or drink day or night for 3 days. I promised my maids and I would keep the same fast, and then I would go to the king if I had to die for it. And that's what we did. I put on sackcloth, put ashes and dung in my hair, and spent the next 3 days and nights in prayer to the Lord God for his people. I reminded him that he was my only helper and told him that through his punishment of exile was all we deserved for sinning against him. These enemies were planning to wipe us out entirely. I begged him to save us, to save his power on earth. And then I asked him for courage and to transform the fires of the king's enmity towards his people, lit and fanned by Haman, into love and favor for us. There was more, I guess, but I can't remember it right now. After the fast, I bathed, had my hair washed and dressed, put on my very best clothes and every single one of my jewels, all gifts to the king. 2 of the maids walked with me. I couldn't have moved without them. I was so weak. I still didn't know what I was going to say, but as I didn't know whether I'd be alive to say anything once I put a foot inside the door of the inner court, that didn't seem a problem. At the door, I took a very deep breath, then stepped over the threshold, raised my eyes, and saw the king's face. Startled? Enraged? Something. I didn't stop to study it. I sank right down in a court obeisance as the room spun. I leaned on my maid and held my breath. The next several seconds lasted a century or so. Then I felt his arms around me and heard him asking frantically, "What's the matter, Esther?" He held me tight, assuring me that I would not die, that the order was meant only for ordinary people. "Come to me," he finished, and laid the golden scepter on my neck. I was overwhelmed, so grateful. I babbled something about his looking like an angel and being frightened on that account. And then, to my shame, I fainted completely. What a champion the Lord God chose in me. He saves my life and I pass out. When they finally revived me, the king kept telling me I should ask for whatever I wanted and he would grant it. I guessed I should bring up Haman and the Jews, but when I opened my mouth, I was as surprised as anyone in that room to hear myself inviting him and Haman to come to a banquet that very day. He laughed in relief, said of course they would come, and sent for Haman to tell him, and I went back to the harem wondering how on earth we would get a royal banquet together, ready in 4 hours. Bless Haggai. He set every slave in the palace to work on that meal, and it was splendid. Haman arrived with the king. They feasted with pleasure, and the king asked me again what I wanted, that even if it were half his kingdom, it was mine. Now that scared me. I was remembering that balance of power in Vashti's fate, you see. And glancing at Haman's face, I realized that I already had too much power to keep. Somehow, things had to shift back. But Uncle had never taught me how to do that. Lord God, help me now, I prayed, and opened my mouth. What came out was an invitation to both of them to another banquet the following day, and a promise that then I would make my request. They were delighted. Haman especially. He had never been so honored. Let me tell you, I was shocked. What was the point of a second banquet? Then it occurred to me that the Lord God must have sent the words. I never would have said them on my own. So I got Haggai started on the next banquet. Later on, of course, I learned what the Lord God was doing between that day and the next. Unable to sleep that night, the king had had the book of Chronicles read to him, had heard the passage describing Mordecai saving his life from the would-be assassins Bigthan and Teresh, and in asking had learned that Mordecai had never been rewarded. He decided that would never do, and as Haman had just arrived on his own business to get the king's permission to execute Uncle for contempt, using the 50-cubit gallows he had just had built, the king asked his advice about a reward for someone unnamed. Assuming that someone was himself, Haman went all out. The king's clothes, his horse, a diadem, a street parade with proclamation by a high noble. All that was to be this person's reward. Hurry then, the king said, and do all that for Mordecai the Jew who works at the chancellery. On no account leave anything out that you have mentioned. Shocked to the core, Haman opened his mouth, but fortunately for him could say nothing. Instead, he smiled and set off, no doubt grinding his teeth once he was well away from the palace. He knew he had to carry out for his enemy to the letter the reward he had designed for himself. That's how the Lord God restores the true balance of power, and that was only the beginning. Haman finished up, went home, and told his wife Zeresh and the others what had happened. They were the ones who advised him to build the gallows and execute Mordecai in the first place. But they gave him no comfort. Indeed, they reminded him that if Mordecai, who had just risen above him so dramatically, happened to be a Jew, Haman would never be able to surpass him. And at that point, the servants from the palace arrived to bring him to my banquet. I knew nothing of Haman's forced honoring of Mordecai that day, of course, and it was a good thing. I was frightened enough as it was of the man's hatred and envy and of that decree hanging over us. The banquet passed for me in a blur, and we got to the last of the wine in what seemed like 10 breaths, though I knew it was 3 hours or more. Once again, the king asked me what I wanted of him and promised he would give me anything I wanted. This time, when I took my deep breath and opened my mouth, the words that came out were no shock to me, for they were the truth of my heart and my being. I asked him to grant me my life and the lives of my people, for we had all been condemned to die. I told him I wouldn't have asked if we were simply to be enslaved, but since we were to be killed, the one man who persecuted us could not possibly repair the damage that could be done to the kingdom, nor undo the king's own loss. I'm going to run out of time, so we're going to go to part 3.